Imagine you are standing in front of a typical American suburban street. The lawns are still neatly cut, the garage lights are still on, and the for sale signs are only scattered here and there. On the surface, everything looks fine, but under that calm coat of paint, the American housing market is flashing a serious warning. Foreclosures are climbing again in a steady rhythm, while the pressure of living costs and the job market is slowly eroding the ability of the middle class to hang on. The title of this video sounds dramatic, something like this: 2008 is coming back. Foreclosure cases are surging as layoffs spin out of control. But what we are going to do is more important than trying to scare anyone. We are going to unpack the data, understand how the stress spreads through the system, and then look at everything through the lens of Warren Buffett, a man who almost never enjoys flashy macro predictions, but is extremely good at spotting structural risk when the tide starts to go out. Here is the key idea. 2025 may not repeat 2008 in the sense of blowing up in a single night. It may be dangerous in a different way, more like a long, slow financial suffocation. That kind of pressure can push many households into a position where they are forced to sell, forced to cut back, and eventually fall behind on payments and end up in foreclosure. Not because they took crazy loans, but because their cash flow breaks. Let us start with foreclosure data. According to data company Atom, in October 2025 alone, the United States saw 36,766 properties receive a foreclosure filing, which includes default notices, scheduled auctions, or bank repossessions. That was an increase of about 3% from the previous month and 19% from the same month a year earlier. It was also the 8th straight month of year-over-year increases, which means this is no longer a random bump. Adams still stresses that the level is lower than past peaks, but the scary part now is the direction and the speed of the trend. If we zoom the camera out, the mid-year report from Adams shows that in the first 6 months of 2025, there were a total of 187,659 properties with a foreclosure filing, an increase of about 5.8% from the same period a year earlier. In other words, the hotspot is not just a single month, it is a fairly persistent upward pattern. So why are foreclosures rising when home prices have not crashed yet? Because prices that have not crashed can be a sign of a frozen market. Owners who locked in low mortgage rates do not want to sell. People who would like to buy cannot afford today's high rates. Transactions dry up. Prices look stable on paper, but financial stress builds up inside the households that are making payments every month. Take mortgage rates. Freddie Mac's weekly survey shows that the average rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage in the week reported on November 20th, 2025 was about 6.26%. At that level, the dream of refinancing back to the 3% era has almost vanished. Millions of homeowners are stuck in a strange position. They may still hold their old low-rate loans, but they cannot move, cannot upgrade, and will find it very hard to sell if the market weakens, because buying again would mean taking on a much higher rate. This lock-in effect makes the market look stable while new demand quietly weakens. As new buyers weaken, the foundation of the housing market starts to show. The National Association of Realtors reports that in 2025, first-time homebuyers made up a record low share of the market, only about 21%, while the typical age of a first-time buyer rose to 40. That is not just a story of people buying later in life. It is a sign of a generation being priced out by home prices, interest rates, student debt, and living costs that rise faster than savings. When that new buyer segment is weak, the market loses a natural layer of support. When a wave of forced sellers appears, but a housing market rarely breaks starting from prices. It usually starts with late payments. And here is a number worth pausing on. The Mortgage Bankers Association reports that in the third quarter of 2025, the seasonally adjusted delinquency rate on 1 to 4 unit residential mortgages rose to about 3.99%. At the same time, the share of loans that entered the foreclosure process in that quarter rose to about 0.2%. The association notes that the pressure is especially concentrated in loans backed by the Federal Housing Administration, and the reasons are very down to earth. A softer job market, other personal debts, plus property taxes, homeowners insurance, and various fees are stretching already tight household budgets even further. In other words, 2025 is not necessarily a story of toxic lending the way it was before 2008. It looks more like a story of decent loans in a very expensive life. All it takes is one income shock, and you can get a domino chain. First the credit cards, then late payments, then rushed sales, and finally, foreclosure. So where do American households stand right now? Look at total debt. The New York Federal Reserve reports that total household debt in the third quarter of 2025 reached about $18.59 trillion. Credit card balances alone reached about $1.23 trillion. When debt is at record levels in a high interest rate environment, even a small pause in income can let the interest alone drain the savings cushions of many families. Here is a point you should really underline in your mind. Many people think a housing crisis only hits the poor. In reality, in 2025, there is another kind of damage. The middle class and the upper middle class may be carrying massive fixed costs.
Bought homes in good neighborhoods with large mortgages. On top of that, they pay for insurance, property taxes, tuition, car payments, and more. All of that adds up to a machine that burns cash every month. As long as the job is stable, they keep that machine running smoothly. But if they are laid off, or if their income drops, they discover that what they lack most is not assets, it is liquidity. This is where we borrow the lens of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett has a famous line that goes like this: "You only find out who has been swimming without clothes when the tide goes out." He uses that image to talk about the risks that hide during easy times. In 2025, the tide going out is not necessarily an instant crash in home prices. It can look like a long stretch of high interest rates and rising living costs that slowly exposes the weaknesses in financial structures that depend on steady income. Buffett is also known for a simple rule. Priority number 1 is survival. Priority number 2 is to never put yourself in a position where you are forced to sell. So instead of asking when the crash will happen, he would ask, who cannot survive if the bad times last another 12 months? And the answer to that question lives in the job market. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in August 2025, the unemployment rate was about 4.3%, with around 7.4 million people out of work. That is not a Great Depression level number, but housing is extremely sensitive at the margin. Even a relatively small group of job losses in high-priced metro areas can create big stress, because the mortgages are large and the cost of owning a home is large. The Bureau also shows that the number of people who have been unemployed for 27 weeks or more in August 2025 was about 1.9 million, and that figure had risen significantly compared with a year earlier. When unemployment drags on like that, the safety cushion of a household disappears much faster than most people expect. Now let us zoom in on one place that acts as a warning light for America, the state of Florida. Adam places Florida among the states with the highest foreclosure rates in October 2025. And in that report, Florida actually came out worst, with roughly 1 in 1,829 housing units receiving a foreclosure filing in that month. What makes Florida stand out is not only the economy, but also the structure of the cost of owning a home, especially for condos. Insurance, taxes, and new kinds of pressure on buildings all show up there. After the Surfside condo collapse, Florida sharply tightened its rules for structural inspections of buildings. State law now requires milestone inspections for certain buildings at specific ages and on specific schedules. On top of that, the state agency that oversees condominiums requires condo associations to complete what is called a Structural Integrity Reserve Study, often shortened to SIRS, with important reporting deadlines in 2025. In plain language, many buildings are now required to carry out more rigorous inspections and to build up stronger reserve funds for maintenance. That has led to higher monthly fees for homeowners associations and special one-time assessments in many complexes. For a household living in a condo, that can be an extra hit to cash flow that was already tight. Florida is not alone. The story of homeowners insurance is changing across the United States, especially in areas that are exposed to natural disasters. The United States Treasury has released findings showing that in high climate risk areas, people tend to pay much higher insurance premiums and face a higher chance that their policies will not be renewed. That pushes the cost of owning a home higher and makes it more unstable over time. When insurance costs rise and coverage is tightened, the value of a property depends not only on location and construction quality, but also on whether you can obtain insurance at a reasonable cost. That is a new kind of structural risk that looks very different from 2008. At this point, we have to be honest. 2025 may not be a simple rerun of 2008 because lending standards and the design of mortgage products have changed a lot. What makes 2025 dangerous is something harder to fix. It is the slow squeeze of affordability combined with consumer debt pressure, a softer job market,
and rising costs of home ownership through taxes, insurance, and fees. It feels like a clamp that is slowly crushing the liquidity of households. This is where the mood of the video can shift. Every crisis has two sides. For people without reserves, it is a disaster. For disciplined people, it can be an opportunity. But an opportunity in the Warren Buffett style is never about rushing in to catch a bottom just because of some shocking headline. He would tell you to build a margin of safety and to keep liquidity. When the market is under stress, the winner is rarely the person who guessed the exact date of the bottom. The winner is the person who is not forced to sell and who can wait and buy when prices fully reflect fear. If you are watching this, there are three very Warren Buffett-style questions you can ask yourself. First, if your income dropped or you lost your job for 6 to 12 months, could you still cover your fixed payments, including taxes, insurance, homeowners association dues, and surprise increases? Second, are you using short-term debt to carry long-term assets, which is the trap that forces you to refinance at exactly the wrong time when the market turns bad? Third, are you buying price or buying value? In other words, do you really understand the cash flows and the local risks, or are you only looking at the listing price? To wrap up, the American housing market in 2025 is
sending an uncomfortable message. Foreclosures are rising, delinquencies are rising, household debt is at record levels, new buyer demand is weak, and some structural costs, such as homeowners insurance, are turning into a harder and harder equation. These forces do not have to make the market collapse overnight. What they do is remove the elasticity from the system. And when a system loses elasticity, it takes only one strong enough push, a wave of layoffs, a sharp jump in insurance premiums, or a tough tax season combined with tight association fees, for many families to slide very quickly from strained to broken. If you want to understand why Warren Buffett always keeps plenty of cash and hates being a forced seller, just remember his tide quote. In 2025, the tide is going out slowly, but it is going out for real. That slow pace is exactly what makes many people complacent, right up until the moment they see an auction notice on the lawn next door. So, this video ends with a question. In the next 12 months, will you be pulled under by the tightening of cash flow, or will you be disciplined enough to stand firm and spot opportunities while the crowd panics?